Abdul Mawgood. Our next speaker is Daanish Faruqi. Can I call you doctor yet? Or yeah, you got the doctor title already. Okay, someone was doing their PhD, that's why I got confused. I read all the bios. Daanish, who I've also seen at prior conferences here, is a visiting researcher here at Georgetown University at the School of Foreign Service, and he is going to speak to us about lessons from an Arab Spring activist and its shortcomings. Reflecting on the life of Professor Sa'aduddin Ibrahim, who I noted, who I think Radwan was once upon a time a professor of mine back at American University in Cairo. So I'm very eager to hear this remarks.
Is there space for me to get my...
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm not doing anything interactive, just having the text up. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks, Sarah, for setting the stage with the reminder that the individual I'm about to speak about has valence for a lot of us on a personal and a professional level. So on September 29th, 2023, the world lost one of its most celebrated human rights activists, Dr. Sa'aduddin Ibrahim of Egypt. But barring one standalone article by the Associated Press, the English-language global media did little to acknowledge this loss, merely curtsying to his passing as a footnote. This is unfortunate, as entire generations, both of academic scholars and social justice activists, were inspired by his work. Indeed, like Sarah mentioned, several people in this room have tangible debts to Dr. Saad, as he was affectionately called. I myself began my own scholarly journey as a researcher at his Cairo-based human rights think tank, the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies. So much of this talk will be loosely informed by my own personal experiences. Born in 1938 in Mansoura, Ibrahim began his intellectual odyssey as a sociology undergraduate student at Cairo University. Here he also began his foray into political activism and organizing, serving as president of the student union. In 1962, he moved to the United States for advanced studies, earning a master's in sociological development from UCLA, and finally a PhD in political sociology from the University of Washington. He began his academic career teaching at DePauw University in Chicago from 1967 to 74, but built his major intellectual bona fides back in Egypt, serving as a professor in the Department of Sociology at the American University in Cairo for the rest of his academic career. As an academic scholar, Ibrahim conducted groundbreaking sociological studies based primarily in Egypt. Rereading his earlier essays in English and in Arabic reveal that Ibrahim was deeply vested in social science methodology. In his work on Islamic activism in Egypt, primarily through the Muslim Brotherhood, he demonstrates full command of sociological theory, engaging his subjects on the basis of class and social stratification, as well as ideology. A skilled ethnographer, he and his research team spent combined years interviewing Egyptian Islamists, including militant group members, while in prison. Additionally, he proved well-versed in quantitative methods, being able to weave through census data, election membership statistics, migration patterns, and economic data from organizations like the IMF. His studies on Islamic activism thus brought the rigor of an academic sociologist alongside the perspective of a cultural and linguistic insider. But Ibrahim's true talent as a researcher transcended his mastery of social science methodology. While he was clearly indebted to his training in Anglo-American sociology, he remained equally versed in Arab and Islamic thought and history. In particular, in multiple studies, he brought up the legacy of the 14th century Tunisian intellectual polymath Ibn Khaldun. Deemed the father of the discipline of sociology, Ibn Khaldun produced path-breaking works in multiple disciplines. His magnum opus, Al-Muqaddimah, offered a social, economic, and global history of the rise and fall of empires. In his evaluation of social movements, change, and revolutionary upheaval, Ibrahim repeatedly refers to Ibn Khaldun's theory of al-asabiyya, often translated as social cohesion. Ibrahim describes the phenomenon as a primordial form of solidarity, often associated with tribal loyalties. A strong commitment to asabiyya, he maintained, proved the impetus for seizing political power and instigating revolutionary social change. Though he was clear that tribal solidarity was not in itself sufficient to fully solidify social revolution, in his interpretation of the Khaldunian paradigm, Asabiyya must be coupled by a religious mission, which offers a spiritual raison d'etre for a new political movement's long-term success. He points to the Saudi Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia, the Sanusi movement in Libya, and the Mahdist movement in the Sudan as the last embodiments of the Khaldunian paradigm at work. Now, it's interesting that the Egyptian sociologist gravitated so deeply towards this particular medieval thinker. After all, many figures in the Arab and Islamic intellectual history offered him worthy intellectual interlocutors on governance and social change. But Ibn Khaldun was unique because of how interdisciplinary he was in his approach to social change. His cyclical history owed as much to the study of economics and demography as it did to the study of historiography. More specifically, Ibn Khaldun stands alone as perhaps the most systematic theorist of social society in Islamic intellectual history. That commitment to the interplay of democratic institutions to push back against the authoritarian political structures throughout the Arab world came to define Sa'd-ad-Din Ibrahim's work both as an academic scholar and as a political activist. He thus founded a human rights NGO specifically to promote the development of civil society and democratization, aptly titled the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies, which housed his most innovative research projects on promoting civic culture and institutions in Egypt and the greater Arab world. Those cravings for civil society led him to emphasize the rights of minorities, pioneering studies in the systematic discrimination against Coptic Christians in Egypt. Similarly, his decades of academic work on Islamists led him to make the controversial case that the Muslim Brotherhood must be granted a legitimate space in Egyptian politics and civil society. The group's exclusion from the public sphere, he warned, would necessarily lead to its membership seeking illicit and potentially violent avenues for articulating its vision. And in addition to relying on the legacy of Ibn Khaldun, Ibrahim grounded his vision on the work of innovative Arab thinkers from the 19th and early 20th century. Like him, this cadre of thinkers sought a vibrant public sphere and had managed to make considerable strides throughout the region prior to the Arab defeat by Israel in 1948. Following the intellectual historian Albert Hourani, Ibrahim refers to this period as the Liberal Age and explicitly identifies it as part of his inspiration. He was thus an avowed descendant of the tradition of Arab liberalism, following in the footsteps of intellectual giants like the Egyptian literateur and former Minister of Education Taha Hussein. Not accidentally, many of these figures associated with the Liberal Age had a soft spot for the work of Ibn Khaldun. And like his colleagues in the Liberal Age, Ibrahim found himself in the crosshairs of the authorities for his research and advocacy on civil society, particularly for his training volunteers in election monitoring, such that in 2000, the Egyptian regime under Hosni Mubarak accused him of using foreign funds to finance his election monitoring campaign and duly sentenced him to prison. Languishing in prison for 3 years, Ibrahim's health deteriorated rapidly. Through international pressure, he was eventually released in 2003, seeking exile for years in the United States. Now, fast forward to the events of 2011 Arab Spring, it seemed that the aging sociologist had gotten the last laugh. Indeed, Middle East historian Juan Cole offered precisely this prescription, penning an article days before Mubarak's resignation in February 2011, reminding his reader that the protesters in Tahrir Square were inspired precisely by Sa'd-ad-Din Ibrahim's vision for a democratic Egypt. His article was aptly titled Saad's Revolution. Or so we thought. In the events of 2013, several major liberal activists and intellectuals in Egypt radically shifted their perspectives, now cheering on the return of military rule. And regrettably, Dr. Sa'd-ad-Din Ibrahim wound up buying into the euphoria of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Most infamously, in an interview for the newspaper Al-Yawm al-Sabi', he was quoted as saying that the 2014 presidential elections were, quote, the greatest in the history of Egypt. Now, what led to this change of heart? As I and my colleague Dalia Fahmy explored in great detail in our last book, the project of Arab liberalism to which Ibrahim subscribed was beholden ultimately to a series of authoritarian contradictions, such that liberals were willing to actively forge authoritarian alliances to forcibly impose their liberal and in many cases militantly secular worldview on an otherwise unwilling populace. Most recently, with Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood actually in control of the state rather than at its fringes, the intellectual consistency of Ibrahim's project could not fully sustain itself. With his passing, though, it behooves us to recognize the contradictions of his thinking, particularly the same blind spots beyond Egypt. All over the Muslim majority context, we see liberal and leftist thinkers who are so terrified of a public role for Islam that they're willing to ally with the most horrific forms of authoritarianism to extirpate it. Thus, working through Saad-ad-Din Ibrahim's legacy will be pivotal in confronting this ongoing challenge throughout the region. But more importantly, we must end by celebrating the immense good Saad-ad-Din Ibrahim's legacy leaves us. I'll end by offering the reminder from the medieval Muslim polymath Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who in his Book of Knowledge points out that the right of the teacher over his student is greater than the right of the father. For a teacher is one who brings to the student eternal life, while the father is the cause only of his temporal life. As a teacher to so many of us, I'll end by offering the good doctor an immense thanks for his tutelage, wisdom, and kindness. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Thank you very much.